Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Gallowgateshots YouTube channel. It is Chris Wallace here, host of the podcast. And as you can see, I am joined once again by Mr. Ben Jacobs himself, who's been doing the rounds recently, haven't you, Ben?
Good evening, Chris. How are you?
I'm not bad, yourself?
Yeah, enjoying the sunshine. Although, as you can see from the camera, I'm untannable somehow. I go from pallid and pale to red lobster during this time of year without any in between.
It's all those dark rooms, mate. It's all those dark rooms you're being in. It's exactly what it is. Right, so I'm just going to open it up to people straight away. People who are watching this evening, I'm going to open the floor to you. Usually, I'd obviously lead the conversation that then we'll end up down rabbit holes, but it might be a bit all over the shop, but we'll do it. We'll see what we can get from this one. So, Ben, I just want to talk. People mention me, Mike, straight away there, but I'll sort it. Don't worry about that. So I just want to say, in regards to the last week on social media, the last week and a half, you've had a little bit of a backlash. Where's that came from? But for people that don't know, where's that came from? Is it just difference in opinion?
I think it's just a mixture of social media and a frustrated and divided fan base. I enjoyed the debate. I always will try and engage with people that are polite and courteous and want to talk about the issues and don't end up making things unnecessarily personal. And I think what's been clear for the last year and a half is that Newcastle United, which is a great football club with a loyal and passionate fan base, are getting very frustrated by, in some people's minds, the lack of a takeover, but in other people's minds, just a simple lack of clarity. And I think there's as many within the Newcastle United fan base, which is not only on social media, and it's important to stress that. There's a lot of Newcastle United fans, in my opinion anyway, that just want this to end. They've got takeover fatigue. They're bored of all of the twists and turns, the false dawns, and whether it happens or not, clarity is what the football club needs, because otherwise it's going to be in limbo once again heading into the new season. And we know that Mike Ashley has in many ways taken a bit of a gamble because he's put all of his eggs in the PIF-led takeover. And as a consequence, if it doesn't succeed, two things will have happened. One, other potential suitors have been warded off during this process because Mike Ashley is clearly confident of getting the takeover over the line. But the other thing is the price of the football club has dropped significantly. So now Mike Ashley has to try and get this takeover over the line because Newcastle United is no longer worth 300 million. It might only be worth half that, even as a Premier League club. And I think that the backlash over the last week is from a tired fan base, a frustrated fan base, and ultimately a divided fan base. And it has at times bordered on the toxic. And part of the reason for that is because there's certain fans that want to believe that everything has a positive narrative. Or if they don't want to believe that everything has a positive narrative, they want to believe that anybody presenting the other side or some form of balance, which I try and do, because there's no point in just talking to one side. You'll get one narrative. You have to try and gather, as a journalist, as much information as you possibly can. And I think there's certain people within the fan base that when they are presented with another perspective, when they're presented with a bit of opinion or fact or analysis and they don't like it, they instantly believe that somehow the person giving that is either, quote, an EPL stooge or a Qatari stooge. And I'm just a journalist trying to cover the story. But I think that fans who are frustrated, fans that want an end to this, fans that just want to ultimately talk about their football club and what's going on the field, fans that want to be excited about the new season, fans that want to carry on the momentum of the last few games of Steve Bruce's tenure last season, fans that are wondering if it's still going to be Steve Bruce or whether that is the last of Bruce and someone else is going to come in, fans that want Benitez, fans that for a brief period about a year ago thought they were getting Pochettino. There's been so many sort of twists and turns and red herrings that I think that the fan base has basically just snapped. And when you're having a debate in person, you can try and rationalize that and you've got more than 250 characters. But when you go onto Twitter, you take a tiny thing that's been said, sometimes out of context, and you jump on it. And unfortunately, certain fans have jumped on that with abuse. They've jumped on that with personal attacks. And that's the irony, I think, Chris, that it's not actually that personal. The takeover is personal. And when people can't get clarity, when they don't get an update as quick as they want, when they don't get a resolution as quick as they want, when they see other clubs succeeding and they feel that Newcastle are falling behind, the snap becomes personal, because what else can you do? Because ultimately we're all just waiting for one, maybe two court cases to resolve, to try and work out what the actual conclusion to this takeover will be.
I want to ask this question straight away, because this is something that gets thrown your way quite a lot, and it's a word bias and it's a word propaganda. Is if you've got something against Newcastle United and you don't want this takeover to go through, or any takeover to go through for that matter. So before, I just want to stop that on social media straight away, and now is your opportunity, mate, to explain why there is no bias and why you're not against Newcastle succeeding in the future.
I mean, I'd love to see Newcastle United succeed. And I've said many times, I think it was one of the first things I said when I came on this podcast, that if the takeover is approved, and is approved in a way where all parties are happy, and they should be, if they abide by the decision of the arbitration, then brilliant, because Newcastle United have presented their case, they've won their case, they've got their ownership group. And if they get their ownership group and they show a lack of separation, then all of the red flags, whether you look at it from piracy or morality, are so far distant from Newcastle United that it not only takes the debate out of the equation, but it provides Newcastle with those layers of safety. My personal perspective and concerns are, if the Premier League are genuine in stating that there's no separation, and as a consequence, Mohammed bin Salman and other government officials as part of the Saudi Arabian state can control the football club, that's worrying from the Premier League's point of view, of course, because they believe the same government had links with piracy, but it's also worrying from the perspective of Newcastle United. But as regards bias, Newcastle United is a phenomenal football club. And any away fan, my team's Leicester, I've said that many times, I always like to get a mention of Leicester in nice and early on any podcast. And of course, we are the model for strong ownership that has a strong affinity with the players and the fan base. But as a Leicester fan, I love going up to St James's Park and sitting pretty much in space in the corner of the ground, watching a football match. I even loved it when you kept beating us in the last minute, like with that famous Shearer hat-trick. And as a journalist, I go to Newcastle and I find the club and the players and the fans extraordinary. I find them affable, and I find the hospitality of the club and the way that people bend over backwards to help you as a professional and as an individual absolutely outstanding. And as a kid growing up, I watched a lot of Newcastle because there was overlap when Newcastle was struggling. I think I've said this story before. They went down to Filbert Street and they needed a result, and Steve Walsh scored a late own goal, and there was a pitch invasion from the shed end opposite the main stand at Filbert Street. And I was only a young kid at that point, and I thought pitch invasion was unbelievably cool. And I don't think we'd ever had that whole stand opposite the main stand at Filbert Street filled with away fans, because again, normally they just got a corner. And then the following season, Keegan won 10 straight games and Newcastle United got promoted to the Premier League. And I believe with Leicester, and I'm going to say this because I've always thought this is an excuse for Leicester, we rested players because we wanted a preferential playoff draw by losing the game. But I think we hammered us on the last game of the season 7-1. It might have even been 9-1, actually. I'd have to check that. And anyway, watching that as a kid, I was like, wow, look what Kevin Keegan's doing. Look at these entertainers. Look at the sort of affinity between the fans and the players. And then up we went to the Premier League, and I've had a soft spot for Newcastle United ever since. So there's nothing against the football club, and there's nothing against Newcastle United succeeding. So if you were to present a hypothetical takeover with no details and say that whatever that takeover is, whether it's the Saudi-led takeover or a completely new one, if you were to say to me that that deal is going to get Newcastle United strong and competing and winning things, then as long as they finish behind Leicester City, then I'm absolutely loving that, because it's one of my favourite clubs in football, let alone the Premier League. And again, I've said that countless times. And how many times on social media do I have to post the photograph of 7-year-old me in the Newcastle brown ale shirt when I wobbled a little bit and almost stopped supporting Leicester, and I bought that kit and I wore it almost every single day to school. But with this specific takeover, my point has always been not about bias, just as a journalist presenting the facts. And it's gone on so long that, of course, it hasn't all been positive. In fact, of course, it all leans to the negative, because if everything was positive, if everything was in Newcastle's favour, if everything was manufactured against the club to make them fail, if everything was delayed on purpose, if everything was about derailing Newcastle from whatever angle you want to pick, the morality angle, the piracy angle, the big six angle, if it was all just against Newcastle, then something would have come out, something would have been disclosed, and I think we know a lot more already. Now, I will hold my hands up and I'll report it if disclosure from the anti-competition case shows damning information of the Premier League intentionally derailing the takeover. It changes the landscape, and I fully accept that. And again, I've consistently said that. But right now, on the bias front, I think the main point is that as a journalist, you try and relay information, and you try and do that with balance, and you try and give as much analysis as you can to add to the story. And because it's gone on so long and there's been no takeover, naturally it will skew towards the negative. Otherwise, we simply would have had a takeover. So that's not bias. That's just the fact that the weight of the story over the last year and a bit is just more negative than positive.
Does it frustrate you slightly because you're not saying what people want to hear on social media? Does it frustrate you slightly that you get this barrage of abuse at times from certain individuals amongst the fan base?
I think it frustrates anyone on social media when you get abuse, when you're trolled, when you're insulted, when you're called rude words. And part of the problem with social media is that we're all becoming a bit blasé to it, and it seems natural as a faceless troll to start Chris1234 and go, "Oh, Ben Jacobs, you specky Qatari stooge, Stephen Merchant wannabe." And after a while, you sort of have to laugh because there's not that many insults I haven't been called. So when people think perhaps they're being clever and coming up with something new, I can probably just scroll back a week or two, or certainly a year, and I can find it. And actually, it's nothing new, because this isn't the first and it won't be the last takeover that I've covered in an investigative capacity and as a broadcaster. And I got just as much abuse from Leeds United when I spoke to them about their GFH takeover, which went very sour very quickly. But when it first broke, a lot of people said that wasn't going to happen. And I reported it, led by David Hay, who ended up in prison. And again, the Leeds fans jumped on me in the same way. And I think the most frustrating thing is not so much the abuse for me, although I really would encourage people to be kind, because you don't know what everyone's thinking. And every time you just band an insult around, whether to me or anyone else, you don't know how that impacts them. You don't know what it does to their day. You don't know the state of their mental health. You don't know what the levels of their self-esteem are. And remember, when you do it to someone like me, I'm acting in a professional capacity as a journalist. And although I predominantly broadcast and investigate, I use Twitter to fill in the updates. So people will say, "Well, Ben, what are you writing on the takeover?" And I'll respond as I always do. I broadcast on the takeover. I broadcast internationally, and I'm on radio. I've done 7 or 8 hits over the last year for TalkSport, for example, contextualizing the takeover. Those are available online as well. So people can find 1 or 2 of them if they want to listen and hear some of the context. I go on the podcast to try and engage as well. But I also do investigations. So when I published, for example, my investigation into piracy in Saudi Arabia, that's not just one piece. That's 9 months worth of work. That's going 3 times to Saudi Arabia. That's getting in with the Saudi Arabian government. That's talking to Saudi Media City. That's talking to the Saudi Authority for Intellectual Property. That's doing undercover work. That's reading and analysing reports like Mark Monitor and NAGRA, which are on frequency analysis. That's talking to legal experts. That's obviously engaging with beIN Sports as well. And then it comes out and it's 5,000 or 6,000 words. So it's essentially like a mini thesis. And people kind of say, "Well, what effort did you put into that? That's the only thing that you published on BLQ." But it's an investigative piece that adds to the story that takes months and months and months, because that's one of my disciplines. And those contacts forged in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar and at Newcastle United and in the Premier League are used in this context to try on social media. And when I come on shows like this and when I broadcast, to give you as much balance as I possibly can. And I don't stand here and say, I'm right about everything. And we know that the takeover has changed dramatically every 5 minutes. So as a consequence, I was one of the first to report the deal was imminent. I was one of the first to then report that there were, in fact, red flags. And part of that is, again, because things have consistently changed and because each side has had a completely different and competing narrative. But I think the underlying thing I'd say with the social media is just to be kind, because when you attack me, you're attacking me for doing my job. And I don't think that's as fair. I don't think any abuse is fair, but I don't go around finding someone doing their day job, and because I don't agree with them, or I don't think they're doing a good job, or I think there's a factual inaccuracy there, I don't go around calling them up or writing to their employer or making a complaint. But somehow social media has developed this troll-like, faceless, no consequences, no accountability, almost high, where people think that the best way that they can engage with someone, instead of asking a fair question or an opinion, and usually if they do that, I'll try and give them an answer, but instead they think that they can just band around a petulant one-liner to try and demean somebody. And to be perfectly honest with you, that's not on. I'm fortunate as a journalist, I've become quite thick-skinned, so I try not to let it get to me personally, but this isn't just me. This is countless journalists. This is countless Newcastle United fans in the context of the takeover. These are MPs at times. These are government officials, or perhaps anyone affiliated to the Premier League that may be on Twitter. And people find them and they track them down and they start a nameless account and they call them something horrible. And that, plain and simple, is bullying, and it needs to stop.
Yeah. One of the questions which nobody's asked it tonight in the comments yet, but something which I've seen over the last week is, why are you so heavily invested in obviously explaining what you believe to know is the truth and what you're saying as facts? Why, if you're not getting paid, and this is, it's not from me, but it's something which I have seen on social media, and you've probably seen it as well, people saying, why are you so heavily invested? Why do you feel as if you need to come on these sort of things when you're not making any money off the back of it? Is it just down to fans requesting your opinion on it, or you take it from there, Ben?
Well, I don't think it's correct to say I'm not making any money off it. I'm a journalist, and every single time I do a hit for Al Jazeera or A News, or every time I go on a radio station like TalkSport or the international ones that I do, or every single time I do an investigative piece for the Blizzard, which is 6 months' work, I get a paycheck. So it's fair to say that both the takeover, but more importantly, the issues around the takeover, which is how ultimately I first had an inpoint into this, are consistently making me money. Every single time a broadcaster does a hit with me, that's a paid hit, and I do them all over the world consistently. Every single time I write an article, again, I get money from that. So the reason why I'm invested in it is because those who use me on the broadcast side, or those who commission me, as with the Be Out Q piece for the Blizzard on the investigative side, are, guess what, paying me. It's entirely incorrect to say I'm them being paid by the Premier League, or I'm them being paid by beIN Sports. That's absolute nonsense. And I can tell you one thing, that if those organizations chose to go to people and feed them that information, they absolutely at the same time would not be putting them on podcasts and broadcasters, and they wouldn't be seeking the same person that is writing an expose with both sides that gives counterpoints and counter sources, like with my Be Out Q piece, talking about all the stuff that beIN perhaps got wrong. But at the same time, people think that beIN pay me. And people say I'm a Qatari stooge, but Google some of the work I've done at Sports Talk, or Google some of the columns and opinions that I've done for USA Today, a big American broadcaster, where regularly I wrote pieces about Qatar losing the World Cup, about bribery when Qatar first won the World Cup, about human rights issues and migrant workers, all around sort of 2011, 2012, 2013. And again, people just forget that because it's nothing to do with Newcastle. Perhaps not all the articles are online, some of them are in magazines. But the funny thing is that when you talk to people that worked with me in the Middle East, they'll laugh at the notion that I might be a spokesperson for Qatar, because I was known in the Middle East as being quite confrontational and quite aggressive in the way that I wrote, because again, I'm from an investigative background, so I'm trying to dig behind a story and get beyond just the superficial. But it's entirely incorrect to say that I'm sitting here reporting on a takeover and not getting paid for it. I've been paid for it regularly and consistently, along with other stories that I've done throughout the course of the last year and a half. And I'm not so much invested in this story either. I think the more accurate way of putting it is that the story has become invested in itself. So when I first spoke about it, why was I invested in it? Because I have excellent contacts across all of the Middle East. And consequently, I can get to the right people to add value. And the way that you distinguish yourself as a journalist is by having a niche. And one of my niches, having lived in the Middle East and North Africa, has been reporting on stories from the Middle East. And as a consequence, when Leeds United were taken over, I covered that from the UAE and Bahrain. And it's the same for the Newcastle takeover. And I was Middle East correspondent for TalkSport when I was living in the UAE for 7 years, and whatever the Middle East story was, positive, negative, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, pre-blockade, post-blockade, they would call me to do a hit, and we would go through the stories, and those range from takeovers to things like Real Madrid theme park in Ras Al Khaimah. But again, people get a warped perspective. And it's also important to note that the algorithm on Twitter shows you what you're interested in, and it shows you what you want to see. So if you constantly engage about Newcastle United on your individual feed, you'll be alerted more to Newcastle United. But the last big investigative piece I wrote was on sexual abuse in the Afghan women's national team. The piece before that I wrote was a cover shoot for Vogue on the Saudi Arabian women's football team starting. And the piece before that was the investigative piece on BLQ. And given I've just said that my written work can take between 4 and 6 months to put together, that's a year and a half's worth of written work, plus all the broadcasting I do. And then I think people forget that day on day, I'm a football commentator. So I've done the last season broadcasting on the FAWSL, which goes on the BBC and which goes on BT Sport and which goes all around the world on the world feed. And I do consultancy work on top of that for various clients as well. So I think people want to create this narrative of like, you're just talking about Newcastle United. And that's because Twitter and other social platforms, as per the name, are social. So you have that opportunity in between the gaps to engage with people, to answer questions. And I always enjoy talking to fans. So if I have the opportunity and the time to answer a question based on things I know, based on things I'm investigating, or based on things that I've previously written, then I will attempt to do that civilly and to try and offer that perspective, because someone's taken the time to ask me a question, and as long as they're not goading, as long as they're not insulting, I'll attempt to reply. But my work is not through Twitter. That's just where the noise comes from in between the various hits or things that you write. And again, the Newcastle takeover has become a more invested story because it's just dragged on and on and on. And I'm not the type of journalist that will just go, okay, it's dragged on too long now, I've got other things to do. So until the takeover concludes, I'm going to keep an eye on it. Until the takeover concludes, I'm going to broadcast about it. Until the takeover concludes, I'm going to consider investigative pieces about it. But right now, the next investigative piece about the takeover is the aftermath piece. And for the last 3 or 4 months, I've been pitching that and I've been researching that. But the truth is, what more can you really say about a Newcastle United takeover right now, other than rehash perspective, rehash sources? You can't really say this has happened, or this is the conclusion, or this is the reason for X, until one or both court cases have finished. So everyone really, including the journalists, local, national and international, we're all to some extent in a little bit of limbo.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. It seems like the takeover is stuck in a middle ground right now, and like you've said, that we won't know the outcome until it's all done and dusted. What I want to do, I just want to go through some of the comments that people have put on here. There was one from a while ago now. I do apologize for taking so long to put this on. But it's from Graham Bell. It says, I don't fully understand how the piracy issue aligns with the Saudi state. Piracy is an issue in every country, including the United Kingdom. My understanding is just that KSA did nothing to stop it.
The narrative that KSA just did nothing to stop it is specifically from the WTO report, which is only one report. And that report had a very restrictive remit, namely to see whether Saudi Arabia did enough to prevent piracy. And the WTO report, which is public, so anybody can read it, essentially concluded that Qatar did have a, quote, de facto case against the Saudi Arabian government, but the specific remit of the WTO was simply to determine whether enough anti-piracy measures were in place. And Saudi Arabia, of course, responded by appealing against the ruling. Interestingly, of course, they claimed victory first, but then they tabled an appeal, which sort of goes against claiming victory, because if you claim victory, you've got nothing to really appeal against. And that appeal has sort of almost brought the whole WTO narrative into a bit of gridlock, because there's currently no appeals body that exists because Donald Trump axed it. So Joe Biden needs to come in and work out what to do with the WTO appellant body. And then at that point, Saudi Arabia's bluff will be called, because they'll either have to table their appeal and have it heard and risk losing again, or they'll have to withdraw it. Or, of course, the third scenario is they'll have to present enough evidence that they did do enough to stop BLQ, and then they'll win. But one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia can't present enough evidence to show that they did enough to stop BLQ is all of the other stuff around that particular piracy network. So you've got the EU report, which is relatively damning and goes further than the WTO report, in that it concludes that Saudi Arabian officials, including government organizations without naming individuals, must have explicitly known about BLQ, because BLQ was actually airing on their frequencies. And then you have all of the sort of geeky reports, which are also online, that basically just look at data. And there's the Mark Monitor report and the NAGRA report that look at Arabsat specifically, which is the Pan-MENA organization, but they focus on the HQ in Saudi Arabia, which is exclusively run by the Saudi Arabian government. And they say the channel beamed through Arabsat, which means, again, over the course of BLQ functioning, why didn't the Saudi Arabian government turn it off? Which is partially why the WTO think that there is a strong case against the Saudi Arabian government. But there's all kinds of other things as well. And this is what I mean about me being an investigative journalist. I went over to Saudi Arabia. I analyzed the box myself. I spoke to government officials. I spoke to prominent individuals. I spoke to whistleblowers. But a lot of the evidence is also out there. And there's damning evidence, like Celavision, a prominent Saudi Arabian company that does also have a base in Dubai. Their CEO, who is one of the most powerful individuals in business and has ins left, right, and center with the Saudi Arabian government, his credit card was used for the hosting rights for BLQ, whilst at the same time Saudi Arabia say that it originated from Cuba and Colombia. So what's the head of Celavision doing? Making a credit card purchase. And this is not a point of dispute. This is an actual credit card receipt given by the company that built the hosting rights online for BLQ. So you'd either have to say that they're out of nowhere manufacturing that, or Celavision are involved. And then the whistleblowers and the photography that I've seen shows a call center in Daman. It shows an HQ in Riyadh. And this may all seem tangential to the Newcastle United takeover. I get that people will be listening and saying, well, okay, that's the Saudi Arabian government, but what's it got to do with PIF? And to the point of the question, they may also add, why is it relevant when piracy is everywhere? And I think the answer to both is that BLQ was not just bedroom piracy. It was not a one-off stream. BLQ was an immediate follow-on to a state-sponsored sports channel called PB Sport. And weeks before BLQ started, PB Sport was launched by Saudi Arabia in a joint venture with Egypt. And they had Maradona and a number of other prominent pundits, and they did a big showy launch, and it was going to be 15 channels, and they were going to buy all the sports rights in the world to compete against beIN Sports. And then what happened? 3 weeks later, the channel disappeared. Nobody explained why the channel disappeared, and the exact same concept with the exact same number of channels emerged and was called BLQ. And it was promoted by prominent Saudi individuals. Yes, it's true. The WTO doesn't say government officials. It says prominent Saudi officials. But when you're out there, you have to appreciate that prominent and government become a sort of gray area, because so many prominent officials either have sway in government or they are, in fact, also elected government officials, but they have a private business as well, like Prince Talal, who was rumored to buy Marseille. Classic example of somebody that's a private investor but has huge control over the Saudi Arabian government as well. So what you have is a scenario where BLQ emerges and is not bedroom piracy. It's a multi-channel network. It's the most advanced form of piracy we've ever seen. It's got a call center, it's got branding, it's got pre-match presentation, it's got pundits, it markets itself for a monthly subscription. It's basically a sports channel in everything other than the fact that it doesn't buy rights. It steals rights from all around the world. And the Premier League believe that they have enough evidence to link BLQ to the Saudi Arabian government. And yes, the WTA may say, well, the best link you can make is they didn't do enough to stop it. They turned a blind eye. And that's fine. I appreciate that. That's the best case scenario for Saudi Arabia. It was a rogue channel. They didn't know that much about it. Finally, when they realized, they shut it down, but they should have known about it before. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is they founded it and they funded it. And the reality from investigating it is probably somewhere in the middle. But from the Premier League's point of view, they tried, independent of beIN and anyone else, to go 7 times to Saudi Arabia and instigate civil action to get to the bottom of this. And they were blocked because no legal firm would take a case against the Saudi Arabian government. And that's worrying, because if the Saudi Arabian government had nothing to hide, they would have allowed a case against them and they would have won that case, and then we wouldn't be in this position. But the reason why piracy is important and the reason why BLQ is so important is because the Premier League have bad blood against the Saudi Arabian government. So naturally, if they believe, and forget what beIN believe, because the Premier League have also come to their own conclusions, if the Premier League believe the Saudi Arabian government are part of PIF, and they believe the Saudi Arabian government were part of BLQ, then of course they're not going to want to approve a sale to people that they think stole their rights.
Yeah, one of the things which I want to mention, and this is probably good for people who haven't been watching from the start, obviously at the very start, and same on the last podcast that you did with myself, you mentioned being a huge Leicester fan. Obviously Leicester were one of the clubs that weren't involved in this Premier League Big Six. Obviously starting their own Super League, as they like to call it. But one of the questions which is in here saying, it's from Josh Pickard, that says it's all down to anti-competition of the other big clubs. They all know that the power will get from basically Newcastle getting taken over, and the power that we would have as a football club going forward will affect them in transfers, trophies, and their status. Which is probably correct to a certain degree. That any big hitter that comes in, especially somebody like Newcastle United, who's always referred to as the sleeping giant, could go and do similar to what Leicester's done, and obviously rustle some feathers amongst the Big Six. So speaking as a Leicester fan, what was your opinion on that from this Big Six and the Super League?
With the Super League, what's interesting is that you had 6 clubs that broke away in a power move, and that move went against the Premier League. So if you bring it back to the takeover and you somehow think that the Premier League are in cahoots and collaboration with the Big Six, well, the Premier League and the Big Six are probably on the worst terms that they've been on for a while, because those 6 clubs, even though they anticipated when they joined that they'd still be able to play in the Premier League, suddenly found themselves almost in the long run having to pick between the Premier League and Champions League and international competition and the European Super League. And then when the fan outrage was added to it, they U-turned very quickly. And now they've sort of got to sit there with their tail between their legs, because if anything, the Premier League has more control and power over those 6 clubs because they weren't able to break away. And my sense away from the takeover as a Leicester fan is just how sickening it is that any football club thinks it has the right to success without earning it, and thinks that it has the right to be a closed book franchise, because at the time the 6 joined the Super League for 48 hours, you had Spurs and Arsenal in mid-table, you had Leicester and West Ham pushing for the Champions League, and the Premier League year on year is becoming more and more competitive. And I actually think for the Premier League brand, that's what the Premier League wants. My sense as a fan and my sense as a journalist is the Premier League would far prefer to have 20 unbelievable clubs that could just as easily win the league and get relegated, and then 3 go down, and then 3 other strong clubs come up. And before you know it, you don't just have the current notion in the Premier League of anyone can beat anyone, but you actually have almost like a championship style table where with 6 or 7 games to go, the team in 12th might only be 3 or 4 points, a couple of wins off Champions League football. And I think that's the Premier League brand. And with respect to other leagues, that's what differentiates it from, to some extent, La Liga and, usually you'd say the Bundesliga and Serie A, but I think it has to be pointed out that in the last few seasons, Serie A has become an unbelievable watch and the Bundesliga has become highly competitive and PSG were pushed all the way. So actually every league is becoming a little bit like that because that's the benefit of investment and money ultimately. But I don't think that the European Super League is necessarily a reflection of the Premier League plus the Big Six. I think the European Super League is more a damning statement against 6 clubs that think they're bigger, both on and off the field. They think they're the 6 biggest brands, they think they're the 6 biggest clubs, they think they can do what they want, they think they can go where they want, and the 48 hours that saw them join and have to U-turn has taught them a lesson. And to some extent with Arsenal and Spurs, the league table has taught them a lesson, and there was a chance that my team, Leicester, could have even taught Chelsea lesson and pip them to that final Champions League spot too. So what we're learning is that on the field, there's more than 6 big clubs. There might not be more than 6 big brands, but you can argue it the other way as well, that Leeds United are a big brand, Newcastle United are a big brand, Leicester are becoming a big club, but we're not as big a brand as Leeds United and Newcastle United. So there's not that many probably that are big club plus big brand, but there's a lot of big clubs, there's a lot of sleeping giant clubs, and there's a lot of brands that have got potential. And I think that's exactly the way the Premier League like it, which is why my own perspective has always been, if you just said right at the beginning, like I specified, it's a takeover. And if you took out the name and you took out the context and you took out the history and you just said, hypothetically, pie in the sky, here's a perfect takeover, no one's got any problems with it, there's no backstory, there's no questioning, it's just the absolute perfect model business, model professionals, and they're going to give Newcastle United billions and billions. I think the Premier League would just be like, that's absolutely brilliant. It's going to grow the club, it's going to grow the game, and it's suddenly going to mean that 7 clubs, or if you include Leicester and West Ham, 9 clubs, if you include Everton and Aston Villa, 11 clubs, half the Premier League are basically going to be fighting for European spots. And genuinely, I think that's the way that the Premier League want it. There'll be people listening that think what I'm saying is idealistic and naive, but that is my opinion.
Yeah. On the back of that, do you feel as if the Premier League, since the takeover, obviously what was announced, well, proposed takeover was announced, do you think the Premier League have ever been influenced by the same top 6?
The key question here, and it's been levelled repeatedly, is a few things. The main one is, what did the Big 6 respond to any potential or hypothetical lobbying? And that's the thing we don't know. So as I've said openly, even though people constantly question me about it or they believe I'm dodging saying it, but I think I was one of the first to say it, beIN Sports, from the outside in, did write to 19 of the 20 Premier League clubs, and they set out their position specifically on piracy. Now, the irony of that is that there's lots of people that say piracy is not a factor. Well, if piracy is not a factor, then the beIN letter has absolutely no bearing whatsoever. But if piracy is a factor, then you can plausibly make a case that beIN Sports' actions need to be scrutinised, even if, as is their position, they only lobbied from the outside in. However, the key thing here is when the 19 clubs, or for the sake of the question, the 6 big ones, received that letter, what did they do? And that's the bit of disclosure that we're lacking. And I don't think anyone yet knows the answer. Because obviously, if the Big 6 clubs went to the Premier League and said, we demand a meeting, if they went to the Premier League and they said, this should not happen, if they went to the Premier League and said, Newcastle United are a threat, and if you approve this takeover, then we'll do X, Y, and Z. Like, I don't even know what X, Y, and Z could possibly be, because they want to play in the Premier League. They want to challenge for the Premier League. They want the Premier League money. They want to be part of arguably the biggest football brand, certainly league, in the world. So the question is, how did the Big 6 respond? And the answer despite what some people will tell you on Twitter, despite rumors going around, is absolutely nobody knows at the moment. That's become a very closely guarded bit of information, which either means that there's a response that will come out in disclosure, or there are responses that Newcastle United have procured that they'll use in their court cases, or there was no response, in which case the Big Six didn't really have any influence. I don't genuinely believe that the Big Six, collaboratively or individually, tried to derail the Newcastle United takeover. And in the same way that beIN were a vocal presence from the outside in, but privately were quite forlorn about the process because they thought it was just going to be waved through in May and June and July, and then things changed. So beIN were not lobbying, if that's what you want to call it, or being a vocal presence from the outside in and thinking this is a tactics that's working. beIN were making a media stir to champion their own cause of piracy, whilst at the same time saying this is going to happen. And that tells you that they can't have been privy to any of these red flags, because the red flags were apparent long before beIN finally realized that seemingly between the two parties there was some kind of stumbling blocks. It wasn't a case of the landscape changed and beIN's narrative changed. I will regularly communicate with lots of different sides during a story. And in checking in with beIN, which was quite regular over last summer because there was a lot of sort of politics involved in that point. And when I check in with beIN in July and early August, they were like, it's happening. It's going to go through. It's going to be approved. There's not much we can really do. And I think that's partially why they got louder and louder and louder at that point. And then, as we know, the withdrawal had happened over the summer, and then a bit more information came to light, and then beIN changed their tact a bit and they quietened down. But I'm not entirely sure that the Big Six took any real vocal steps to try and influence the Premier League or persuade the Premier League. There's simply no evidence of that. And if you look at the original claims of anti-competition, they're all around the beIN letter, or they're all just around rumour. So if you take, for example, the NCSL's first letter to Richard Masters, which cannot have been written or approved by a lawyer because it's full of jibes and insults, one assumes they sent a more private, professional letter with proper evidence later. But the first letter they sent was from Gordon Stein, and it simply reads, I suspect the EPL has been swayed by some of its other EPL clubs who would rather NUFC does not become an EPL powerhouse again. I will not name them here. And then it goes on to say, as for Mr. Masters, I question if he's fit and proper. I seem to recall he was your third choice. So that's not coming from a lawyer. That's not being approved by a lawyer. It says nothing, it names nothing. Then in a subsequent letter to the Prime Minister, they obviously revealed their Tottenham Hotspur claim, and I'm not going to go deeply into that in terms of an individual club influencing, because I don't believe that there's any truth to that story. And the reason for that, as I've said very publicly, is because they name a company called Eldridge Investments. So their belief is either that there's a Saudi company called Eldridge Investments at exactly the same time as there's another company owned by Todd Bowley called Eldridge Investments. So there's two Eldridges at the same time making a same bid for the same amount of money. And I just think that the odds of that are astronomical. And then when you go to actually Eldridge Investments or Tottenham Hotspur or even PIF now, they all say the same thing, that it's absolute nonsense. So ultimately, I don't see any proof in the first letter because no club is named. And I don't see any proof from Tottenham Hotspur getting involved because I've investigated that from lots of different angles and it's been dismissed. Now, I totally appreciate that there'll be other sides that say we've got evidence. There'll be other sides that say we've spoken to different people. I respect that. And if that information comes to light, I'll hold my hands up and say that the sources I spoke to, which was Eldridge Investments, which was PIF, and which also was Tottenham Hotspur, I'll say they were wrong. They misled me. They gave me false information that I reported. I will say that. But right now, I don't buy that. So then we've actually got a scenario where you have allegations of a top six cartel that are spurned by Mike Ashley using the word dark forces, by a letter from beIN Sports, and from a vague letter from Gordon Stein that says he's not going to name the clubs and provides no further evidence on that point. So what's missing here? And by the way, I've got full respect for fans or activists, whatever you want to call them, groups who want to dig deeper. That should be encouraged. And if they find things that are credible, congratulations to them. And if they've said things already that prove to be credible, then I will have to be the one that holds my hands up and says, I was wrong about this Big Six cartel. But right now, I feel like we've got Ashley's flippant comments. We've got the letters that make allegations that if you believe them, fine, you can constitute that as evidence. I certainly wouldn't dismiss another person's opinion. It's just not my understanding from also talking to sources as a journalist. But the one thing that we're lacking in all of this is anything from the Big Six. So we have no responses to the Big Six, by the Big Six, I should say, from the letter from beIN Sports. We have no leaked information or on-record information from any of the clubs outlining their position. We have no disclosure yet from those football clubs. So there's a big part of the jigsaw puzzle missing when you're alleging a Big Six influence on the Newcastle United takeover. So the only thing at this point that I can say is if anti-competition disclosure provides that information, then the landscape could change. And if it does change, then I will be the first person to hold my hands up and say that my belief and my sources do not marry with the disclosure. But if the disclosure doesn't provide anything, then currently the allegations against the Big Six are largely unsubstantiated. Yeah.
Just because you mentioned that obviously that letter which was sent to the 19 Premier League clubs at the time from beIN, there's a message here from a Mark Cooper that says, so Ben, I don't think piracy is the issue here. It's to do with PIF separation from the Saudi state. It's something which it always comes back to, the separation between the two parties. I know it is hard, but in a nutshell, explain what that means.
We're going to be here until about midnight.
I know. That's why I said in a nutshell. I know you talk. You love to talk anyway, Ben. So, in a nutshell.
The thing is I could be concise, but this is just not a story that's ever allowed for concision because there's so many complex elements that I think fans deserve some in-depth analysis and balance and some facts. So, the brief answer, because I've gone into this in other podcasts, to the first part of the question, is piracy becomes an issue if the Premier League show a lack of separation. Because then when the Premier League test the Saudi Arabian state, they can factor in piracy, which means they can either resolve the issue, they can ask questions on the issue, or it might be cause for rejection. Because as soon as you say PIF equals KSA state, and as soon as the Premier League believe the KSA state were behind piracy, they then can use that if they don't wish to approve the sale. And they won't wish to approve a sale if they believe, as they do, that they are approving the sale of a football club to those that stole their rights. So piracy is not an issue if a separation is proven, but if a lack of separation is shown, then piracy comes right back into the mix. And you could argue human rights does as well, but the Premier League may not make a judgment on human rights because it doesn't directly affect them, but they're definitely going to make a judgment or ask questions or at least try and resolve the issue of piracy if they're able to connect the state and PIF back to BLQ because it's directly relevant to them. So that's always been my perspective, and that's always been what sources have said. And remember, if Newcastle United lose arbitration, PIF could still proceed under just state ownership, but they won't. And PIF sources have told me repeatedly that if they lose arbitration, unless the anti-competition case pulls a rabbit out of a hat, they'll walk away. So why are they walking away? Why are they not being tested just by listing the Saudi Arabian state? It's because there's a private acknowledgement that they don't want all of these issues, piracy in particular, to be dragged through the mud. But for those of you that are listening that don't believe piracy is relevant, that think it's a subplot, that think it's well above Newcastle United, that thinks it has nothing to do whatsoever with any of this, I respect that. And all I would say again is that if piracy has nothing to do with it, then beIN Sports' letter has very little relevance either, because it's pointing out that a sale should not be approved because of piracy. So if piracy is not a factor, the Premier League would simply go, well, okay, thanks beIN Sports, but piracy is not part of this, so we appreciate your concerns, but we'll make our own private determinations. And that, again, is why I think that piracy is a factor. And then more broadly to your question on why the separation is important irrespective of piracy, it's simply because PIF are coming to the table believing that they have legal separation and believing that they can stand that legal separation up with a letter from the Saudi royal court. And in addition to that, the layers of separation that you just get naturally by buying a football club when you've got 3 members of your consortium, when you've got a holding company, and then you've got a football club. So it's not going to be able to, in PIF and Newcastle United's eyes, filter all the way up to MBS or the government. And when I say MBS, that could be MBS acting in his capacity as the head of PIF, or it could be MBS acting as the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. But either way, PIF would essentially argue, we do lots of global business, and at no point has anyone else had any issues in majority or minority ownership when we've done deals with Uber or SoftBank. But the counter argument to that is simply, well, MBS directly negotiated Uber and SoftBank, and MBS seized a private jet company under PIF, which was later used to kill Jamal Khashoggi. And again, there'll be people screaming at me like, you're going on a tangent, you're talking about human rights, it's got nothing to do with Newcastle. Absolutely, I respect that argument. And that's one for the arbitrators to look at. But if a lack of separation is proven, then suddenly PIF's links to the Saudi state are probably bad enough in terms of all the different areas of piracy, maybe human rights, questionable enough that the Premier League would naturally voice some concerns. And then PIF would have a choice. They would have to either answer and alleviate those concerns or walk away. And my understanding is that they will simply walk away, which I think tells you a lot about PIF's own concerns about being dragged too close to the Saudi Arabian government because of their recent past in both human rights and piracy as well. But with the separation, the Premier League will ultimately argue that practical reality, and PIF will argue what they believe is a legal reality. But none of those perspectives actually hold that much weight, because what people often forget is that the separation argument is not broad, it's not definitive, it's not about coming up with a firm conclusion on where PIF and the Saudi Arabian state stand, because anything that arbitration determines won't be used in wider circles, won't be used outside of sport, won't be used in government. Because to be honest with you, there's hundreds of sources in Saudi Arabia, in government, outside of government, in business, outside of business, in sport, outside of sport, within Vision 2030. And if you ask them genuinely and you get an honest opinion, 50% of them think that PIF is separate, and 50% of them think that PIF is entirely influenced by MBS. And there's a lot of grey area, and within lots of different Saudi perspectives, legal perspectives, business perspectives, government perspectives, nobody's kind of got the foggiest. So the point of arbitration is not to come up with an all-encompassing conclusion on whether the legal that PIF present trumps the practical that the Premier League present. The point of arbitration is to determine whether the Premier League's owners and directors test is robust enough for the Premier League to even make this argument in the first place. So it's the semantics of words like what defines control and what defines director that are ultimately going to win or lose the argument. And whether PIF slapped down a bit of paper from the royal court, which MBS could ultimately write himself, or whether the Premier League talk about Jamal Khashoggi and a private jet company that helped kill him, that's really not relevant. It's powerful in the media narrative. What's relevant is this test defined in a way that allows the Premier League to logically make a connection that states the Saudi Arabian state could control Newcastle United or not? And I think if the arbitration is ever made public, which it probably won't be, let's be honest. But if we ever read the ruling, I'm pretty sure the ruling will basically go, we agree with the Premier League's practical side, we agree with the legal classification of PIF, and we've determined that the way the test is written, it's more logical to side with either Newcastle or the Premier League. And if it's Newcastle, I firmly believe a takeover will happen. And if it's the Premier League, I think PIF will just walk away. So the arguments are really important and complex. And Newcastle have obviously got a strong legal team grounded within the Middle East and with a strong reputation. The Premier League are confident in their position. Why are they confident in their position? Because it's their test, it's their wording. And we're almost at a limbo point now where I can talk till I'm blue in the face. I think everyone realizes that, but we just have to wait until the July arbitration finishes and then we'll get more clarity.
Yeah, so just to follow on from that, there's another question in that says, if the Premier League were confident that there was no separation between PIF and KSA, why did they not fail the bid?
Because the way that the owners and directors test works is that the Premier League first had to determine who to test. And they therefore decided that due to a lack of separation, the names listed to actually follow through with the test would have to be more expansive. And at which point PIF declined to simply list the Saudi Arabian states because they believed that they'd done their due diligence, they'd listed everything and everyone that they were asked to. And the Premier League said, sorry, there's an impasse here. We're not going to proceed because we don't know who to test. Now, at this point, you've got two narratives. You've got those that believe that there's corruption that will say, at the point that PIF said, sorry, we disagree with you, we've given you everything you've asked for, please proceed. At that point, if the Premier League couldn't resolve who to test, they should have skipped to the next step and tested, and they should have rejected on the grounds that PIF failed to provide all of the adequate names and information. But the Premier League's bylaws also allow them to arbitrate. And arbitration was not a disingenuous or token or amicable offer. They're obligated to offer arbitration over the sticking point. And it makes much more sense to define who you're going to test and then test them than say from the outset that there's a disagreement over who you're going to test, but then still proceed with the test and then reject them. And again, those that argue the consortium have been hard done by and Newcastle have been hard done by will say, had the Premier League just rejected it, then the consortium would have had a wider appeal and a speedier appeal under the Premier League bylaws, and then they could have still challenged the issue of separation. And the Premier League say, this way, we didn't have to go through time, energy, and money when everyone knew that the end conclusion would be you didn't provide us with enough information. So we did the other approach, which is also in our bylaws, which is we offered you arbitration. And I guess the other thing to note, and this again is a point of contention, and we need more information to determine who's right and who's wrong. But the other thing worth noting is once the impasse was reached, and once the Premier League tried their tact of offering arbitration, which, as I say, they were effectively obligated to do, at that point, what would have happened if the consortium had rejected the arbitration? Then the Premier League would have presumably had to do option 2 within their wording and bylaws, which is formally reject the test. So why at that point did the consortium just withdraw? And I still, to this day, think that did not benefit the consortium, because you can reject arbitration and then what? All the Premier League have done is given you a provisional conclusion, and they've said, we invite your response to that provisional conclusion. And if you wish to arbitrate over that provisional conclusion, we'll arbitrate over that provisional conclusion. And that's what they're doing now. So given that's what they're doing now, why at the time did the consortium withdraw? And had they not withdrawn, we would then know whether the Premier League would have been forced to continue the process and forced to reject it over a lack of listed directors and information, because they ultimately believe that PIF are a lot wider than just PIF. So we'll never know the answer to that because the consortium withdrew. But by publicly withdrawing, even if they claim they were forced out, by publicly making a statement saying they withdrew, and by publicly attributing that withdrawal at the time to the global pandemic, even if that was just PR, that doesn't help them, in my opinion, because that's there on record. And there's not much in this takeover that's on record, and that's there on record. And I think the consortium withdrawing almost stops the Premier League having to take another approach. I think the Premier League probably breathed a sigh of relief when the consortium withdrew, because it's all very well saying the Premier League offered arbitration and the consortium didn't want to do arbitration at that time. But then what's the next step? You can't just leave it at that. Like, sorry, we said do arbitration and you don't want arbitration, so there we go. We'll just put it in a file somewhere. Come back to us if you change your mind. All the best. That's not how it would have worked. There had to be a next step. So why was it a withdrawal? And if there wasn't a withdrawal, what would have happened next? And that's a big question mark that's really critical, but we'll probably never know the answer to.
Yeah. My final question for you is the reason why this didn't go through, well, not why it just didn't go through, but why it didn't go on longer than what it should have done and reached the likes of the fit and test, was that down to PAF walking away from the deal, or was that by the Premier League dragging their heels, as people put it, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as I say, we'll never know unless we see more disclosure. So those saying the Premier League dragged their feet make a nice narrative. It sounds powerful on social media. And the longer things go on, the more perhaps fans want to believe that. But let's not forget, these the same people that said the Premier League dragged their feet with the arbitration when it was Newcastle United that took 5 months to appeal the panel chair. So that's not the Premier League dragging their feet. That's Newcastle United causing a delay. The delay by Newcastle United, by the way, seems just to me. It seems logical. Why wouldn't they want to appeal someone that they think has bias? But fundamentally, that was not orchestrated by the Premier League. And I remember when I went on a podcast and I said that my sources are telling me that Newcastle United are the ones causing the delays, logical and just delays, like I say, but nonetheless delays. And again, there was a social media backlash, and that's now been proven to be correct. So if disclosure shows that the Premier League didn't carry out their owners and directors test correctly, if they didn't do so in a timely manner, if they chose to be influenced by allegedly third parties or other football clubs, then all of that is evidence that shows that the Premier League dragged their feet. And you can make an argument for that. And if it turns out in the anti-competition case that disclosure shows us some clues towards that, then there may be some overlap and some evidence that can be used as a silver bullet in the arbitration. And the only thing that kind of wards me off that a little bit in terms of the theory, other than a lack of proof that's currently out there, is that if Newcastle United genuinely thought they were going to get a bombshell from disclosure, Newcastle United would be the ones delaying the arbitration. It's not in Newcastle United's interest, if they're going to get a bombshell from the disclosure in an anti-competition case, to finish the arbitration first. Because if they lose arbitration, that's basically it. Certainly in my opinion anyway. Other people may disagree. So if I'm Newcastle United and I'm adamant that I've got 2 silver bullets, 1 in each law case, and I'm adamant that the anti-competition case could take a year, even 2 years, and PAF might lose interest anyway. But if I know that disclosure comes quite quickly, then the first thing I'm doing as Newcastle United is saying to arbitration, because there is material overlap between the 2 cases, I'm saying to the panel, I want you to wait until August or September, because then I'm guaranteed my disclosure, and then we'll be able to factor that into the arbitration. Whereas right now, the timescales are too tight, and there's a chance that some disclosure comes, but you can't guarantee it. And arbitration, once the hearing starts, happens very, very quickly. So even though the award might take several weeks, the arguments and the deliberation could be as quick as a day, but in all likelihood, it will be no more than 7 days. So we don't know when in July, but we know it's in July. And if that's like July the 1st, I'm not sure that any of the disclosure will really be apparent at that point or relevant to the arbitration. So therefore, if that narrative is correct of the Premier League dragging their feet, then why wouldn't Newcastle United delay the arbitration further in order to maximise the disclosure? And then, of course, you can say dragging their feet as regards the grand old Duke of Yorking. And we need to learn more information about this, but it looks like PR messaging, and it looks like the messaging is implying that government departments should be led up the hill and then back down again because there might be takeover news, but we're not quite sure yet. And I don't think there's too much wrong with that. If the Grand Old Duke of Yorking, of course, is relevant to Newcastle United being messed around, it's a completely different ballgame. But reading those messages, it doesn't appear that logical to me. So then what you're looking at is the counter side, which is, did PIF just walk? And in favour of that is the fact that that's what they said they did, and that's what they acknowledged, both publicly and privately. But the counter argument to that is, if PIF did just walk, why didn't they just walk? Why are they still around? So the fact we're doing arbitration over separation tells you that PIF are still at the table. They're not actively involved, but they're waiting. And if Mike Ashley thought for 1 minute that if Newcastle United won arbitration and PIF were no longer interested, he wouldn't be doing arbitration, because you're battling over, is or isn't PIF separate from the Saudi state? And if PIF are like, go ahead, have that argument, but we can't guarantee we're going to come in and complete the acquisition of this football club, then what's the point? All you're doing is fueling a load of lawyers' pockets. So you sort of have the Premier League saying they didn't drag their feet, and Newcastle United needing to find clear proof of that, of which at the moment there's a lot out there that's only speculative. And then you have PIF walking away because they got tired of the process, but then they got very untired of the process very quickly because they're still at the table. So that's why I think the withdrawing was a mistake. I think they did get frustrated by the Premier League's position, and I think they walked away. And I think that walk away at the time was a genuine move of frustration. But then I think they massively regretted it. And I think they saw the fan reaction, and I think they saw the warmth towards a takeover and what it could bring to the club and the community. And maybe when they saw that, they thought, okay, let's come back to the table if there's a legal route towards fixing this. But I think in that moment when they genuinely quit or withdrew, I think that was genuine. And I think if they take over Newcastle United and they're ever allowed to talk about the process, it wouldn't surprise me if they admit that withdrawing and doing so in a public manner, in hindsight, was actually a mistake.
Yeah. I just want to apologise for everybody in the comments that has asked for questions to be read out. As everybody is aware, the deadline is coming up for, obviously, the Premier League. They were granted the extension that was extended June 11th, I think it was. So that's only a handful of days away, really. So I'm pretty confident that we will get Ben on in the near future anyway to answer even more questions on the back of that, because there's going to be more turns along the way in the next week or so.
Yeah, just on that, Chris, it's worth pointing out that the 11th is the deadline to respond, and the response won't necessarily add a massive deal to the equation. I mean, we know from paperwork that's already out there that the Premier League are effectively going to argue that there's material overlap between the anti-competition and the arbitration. And as a consequence, Newcastle are a member of the Premier League, and they've agreed to abide by the Premier League disciplinary rules. So if effectively there's overlap between the two cases, then the arbitration should conclude, and the result of the arbitration will strongly define the next steps. So I think there's a sense that how the Premier League responds will be more to kind of dismiss the anti-competition as not relevant, not because there's not relevant stuff in there, but because the relevant stuff in there is being tackled in another case. So they don't feel, therefore, that this is the time for CAT to get involved. And if they are successful in arguing that, then we might be presented with a scenario where, again, it's all about arbitration in July. But regardless of the anti-competition, unless that disclosure comes out, it's still all about the arbitration in July. But I think the point to note is that I don't sense, I might be proven wrong depending on what goes public, but I don't sense we're going to get like bombshell evidence or counter evidence from either side. I think we're going to get a bit of legal to and fro, and again, challenging the very legitimacy of the body hearing the anti-competition and emphasising the material overlap between the two cases. And then CAT will presumably have to go away and consider that. And then at that point, we'll kind of have a bit more of a roadmap for the anti-competition. And by then, the question again is, will we already be in arbitration? Or if we're not, how many days are between the two? Because once again, if Newcastle United are confident in arbitration rather than hopeful, confident, I should say, in anti-competition, rather than hopeful that anti-competition will unveil more information, and as we've heard, they are seemingly confident. Shock horror, both sides say they're confident in their cases. But if Newcastle United are genuinely confident in what they're going to receive through disclosure, they absolutely will want that disclosure to be factored into arbitration. So again, if that's their position, any delays to anti-competition won't work in their favour. Any dismissal of anti-competition won't work in their favour. But ironically, any delays of arbitration will. So when we're looking at the timeline, I think a lot of fans think, okay, the 11th is a big day, and it is a big day because it's more information, and it gives us a clearer sense of timescales. And all of us just want this to conclude now, including the journalists, by the way, because we're sort of going around in circles. But with arbitration, I think everyone just thinks that's July, that's done, it's going to be quick. But again, as I've said many times now, if Newcastle United find something really pivotal and important to their case in anti-competition, the last thing they'll want to do is find that it doesn't come soon enough for arbitration. So it actually wouldn't surprise me that if that scenario, that specific scenario played out, if Newcastle then want to delay arbitration a little bit to be absolutely sure that what they're uncovering in disclosure becomes relevant to the arbitration case. So yeah, it's complicated. And again, I think people listen and they say, well, can't you just answer in a yes or no? Can't you just be clearer? Can't you just go into less detail? Can't you just stop rambling and going on tangents? And that may be true, we all know I love to talk, but it's just very, very complicated. And all I can do is come on here and talk as honestly as I can, using a perspective from sources, using a perspective understanding the Middle East, talking to lawyers, because I'm not a lawyer, but I can go to lawyers and I can ask them what their perspective is and try and relay it to you. And if I'm informative and helpful to fans, and I get paid for it, because it's my job, then great. And if fans disagree with me or I'm proven wrong, at some point I'll come back on and hold my hands up and say, that was incorrect or I was misled by that. But at this point, it is good that we have some dates in the diary. It is good that we are going to get progress, even if we don't learn about that progress in public. And by August or September, I would imagine that we'll have clarity on the arbitration one way or the other. It could finish a bit sooner. We don't know if it's a July the 1st arbitration or a end of July arbitration. But I think one thing that we do know is that this is not going to drag on for the full season. So whether Newcastle United have a new owner or they're stuck with Mike Ashley or the club's on the market once again and a new suitor comes along, I think it's fair to say that within months now, rather than years or a year or a season, we'll start to understand what the conclusion of this particular takeover is. And I think that helps people because, as I said right at the beginning, of course, a large proportion of the fans want a successful Newcastle. Many of them want a PIF-led takeover. But I think every single Newcastle fan, regardless of that, just wants clarity. They just want an end to it. It's become for the love of God, just get it done, or for the love of God, tell us it's not happening because we just want to move on. Because if you don't move on and the takeover doesn't happen, or you don't move on and the takeover does happen, but it takes more months, then it's a club in limbo. And Steve Bruce doesn't know whether he's keeping his job. Nobody knows what the transfer budget is. And the danger of that, even if PIF take over, if they don't take over in August or September, the danger of that is that this coming Christmas becomes like last coming Christmas and Newcastle United are again fighting relegation. And it's just the last thing you want from a football club, to not know where it stands, to not know what its identity is, to not know where it's heading. That's the most frustrating thing for me as a neutral, taking off my journalist cap. I don't think I could bear supporting a team where I just don't know where it's heading. So the clarity is almost as important as the conclusion, whether the takeover happens or not.
Yeah. What I do want to say that there are a couple of people in the comments here, and I want to address this myself personally. There's been a couple of people asking why I'm not sat here challenging the things you're saying. As a host of this, and as obviously somebody who made Gallowgateshots YouTube channel, what I want to say is anybody that wants to come on here that has a different opinion, that has other thoughts on the whole process, that has conducted themselves in an adult manner on social media and hasn't abused other fans for having a difference in opinion, then they're welcome to come on this podcast. I will sit here and I will do exactly the same as what I have done tonight. I will give them their chance to have their opinion heard. And I'll categorically say that now. So all I want to say to you, Ben, is thanks once again for coming on. It's been a pleasure as always. I feel as if when you come on here, you get a chance to say what you want to say. And obviously the comments coming in and the questions coming in, I try my hardest to go through them. And yes, you may answer them in detail, but that's what we want. We want these answered in detail. What's the point in a yes or no answer? It's not as easy as that, like you've said on numerous occasions.
Yeah, and just to the point that you've just made, challenge me. I mean, whether that's you, but whether that's people listening as well. I mean, I'm not doing kind of anything when you present a story. It sort of miffs me a bit when people think, oh, if we challenge him, it could back him into the corner, or if we challenge him, he doesn't answer. The people that don't get an answer on social media are usually the people that think they deserve an answer, but actually are asking a question with a veiled insult. The amount of times I get like, oh, Ben, why are PIF and the Saudi state not deemed as separate? By the way, you're an idiot and a liar. And it's like, well, I'm not going to stoop and answer that question, because with your left hand, you've given me a question, and with your right hand, you've given me a slap around the face. And the other thing is that because of how toxic and because of how divisive the whole takeover story's been, I will come off anything I do with upwards of 1,000 comments and messages across the next 24 hours. And you won't see them all, or you'll reply to one person's question, but another person asking you an identical question won't see that answer. And that's the problem again with Twitter, that you've got 250 characters and you've got one @. And if you @ to everyone, you've got no characters to type anything. So that's why it's nice to come on these podcasts. But I encourage people to ask questions, and I encourage people to call out what they don't believe in and to challenge it. And that's also why I went on with Keith and had a debate. And I actually thought that the debate on that podcast was civil and courteous. We didn't cover as much as perhaps both of us would have liked, but then it descended into toxicity of social media. And that's a shame, because the debate itself, I think, was much better received, because that's what you get when you're face to face with somebody. You're not going to be discourteous. You're not going to be flippant. You're not going to be insulting. And you've got as many characters as you need to put your point across. So the more debate we have, the better. The more things are challenged, the better. But I'm not sitting here saying I know all the answers. And I'm also not sitting here saying I'm anything other than a journalist. And when people sort of attack you as like a beIN spokesperson or a Premier League spokesperson, they're missing the point. Because when I've got a Premier League bit of information, I've said it's from the Premier League. I've never hidden that. When I've got a bit of beIN information, I've said it's from beIN. When I've got a buying source or PIF bit of information, I've attributed the source, because that's what a journalist should do. So then when someone says, oh, you know, how dare you get a bit of information from the Premier League? That's no different to getting a bit of information from Newcastle United or PIF. What I would say is that the club and the Premier League have been far more silent than the buyers throughout the last year and a half. I've got far more over the last year and a half from Saudi Arabia, where naturally I've got a range of sources, than I have from either Newcastle United or the Premier League. So when people think the Premier League is leaking left, right and centre, and Newcastle are putting things out there in public statements, the irony of all of that is, where do you think the no red flags came from? Where do you think the deal is imminent came from? Where do you think the club is purchase line came from? All Saudi Arabia, all reported by me, all attributed to Saudi Arabia, none of which happened. But somehow a leak or a bit of information, not every leak, by the way, is confidential. Somebody can tell you a sentiment or someone can tell you a direction something is heading in without actually providing a bit of confidential information. So it's not always a document. It's not always something that was confidential. That's not, again, how journalism works. But when you're given something and you use that as a journalist, you still have to go to the other sides to clarify it. And as I've said before, when I've reported stuff from Saudi Arabia that was leaked, it's been heralded. It's heroic, brilliant undercover journalism that has told us the direction the takeover is heading in. And when I've reported something from the Premier League, which I've also attributed in the same way and in the same form, I'm told I work for the Premier League. And it's absolute nonsense. Like other journalists that have covered this, and there's a lot of good journalists out there, Lee Ryder, Liam Kennedy, Luke Edwards gets a lot of unnecessary stick. I know a lot of fans don't like him, but he's done his due diligence and his digging. George Colkin, extremely popular within Newcastle, excellent stuff from The Athletic along with Matt Slater. There's been some really good journalists that have covered this, and they've all got one thing in common, which is they've tried to go to all sides, and it's been a roller coaster. And there's a lot you might want to challenge, and there's a lot you might want to call out, and there's a lot you might want to disagree with. So do it, but do it politely, and do it with insight, and do it with research, and have a debate. And if we disagree, we disagree, and we'll see what happens. But don't stoop to this troll-like level of disagreeing and firing a personal insult or attack at somebody, because it's not a good reflection on the people that do it. It's not good for people's mental health, and it's not going to get you an answer.
Yeah. Right, Ben, I'm going to call it a night because my tea's getting cold.
Yeah, mine as well. My dog needs walking as well.
Like I said 20 minutes ago, mate, it's been a pleasure, as always.
Cheers, Chris. All the best to you.
Watch what you're doing, pal. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.